To the Right Honourable Spencer Lord Wilmington, Knight of the Bath and one of His Majesty's most honourable Privy Council. 'Twas my fortune, my lord, in my juvenile years, musas cum Marte commutare, and truly I have reason to blush when I consider the small advantage I have reaped from that change. But lest it should be imputed to my want of merit, I have wrote these memoirs and leave the world to judge of my deserts. They are not set forth by any fictitious stories, nor embellished with rhetorical flourishes. Plain truth is certainly most becoming the character of an old soldier, yet let them be never so meritorious, if not protected by some noble patron, some persons may think them to be of no value. To you, therefore, my lord, I present them, to you who have so eminently distinguished yourself, and whose wisdom has been so conspicuous to the late representatives of Great Britain, that each revolving age will speak in your praise, and if you vouchsafe to be the machinas of these memoirs, your name will give them sufficient sanction. An old soldier I may truly call myself, and my family allows me the title of a gentleman, yet I have seen many favorites of fortune without being able to discern why they should be so happy and myself so unfortunate. But let not that discourage your lordship from receiving these my memoirs into your patronage. For the unhappy cannot expect favor but from those who are endued with generous souls. Give me leave, my lord, to congratulate this good fortune that neither Whig nor Tory in this complaining age have found fault with your conduct. Your family has produced heroes in defense of injured kings, and you, when 'twas necessary, have as nobly adhered to the cause of liberty. My lord, your lordship's most obedient and most devoted humble servant, G. Carleton. To the reader. The author of these memoirs began early to distinguish himself in martial affairs, otherwise he could not have seen such variety of actions both by sea and land. After the last Dutch war he went into Flanders, where he not only served under the command of His Highness the Prince of Orange, whilst he was generalissimo of the Dutch forces, but likewise all the time he reigned King of Great Britain. Most of the considerable passages and events which happened during that time are contained in the former part of this book. In the year 1705, the regiment in which he served as captain was ordered to embark for the West Indies, and he, having no inclination to go thither, changed with an half-pay captain, and being reconsequented to the Earl of Peterborough by the late Lord Cutts, went with him upon that noble expedition into Spain. When the forces under his lordship's command were landed near Barcelona, the siege of that place was thought by several impracticable not only for want of experienced engineers, but that the besieged were as numerous as the besiegers. Yet the courage of that brave earl surmounted those difficulties, and the siege was resolved upon. Our author, having obtained by his long service some knowledge of the practic part of an engineer, and seeing at that critical time the great want of such, readily acted as one, which gave him the greater opportunity of being an eyewitness of his lordship's actions, and consequently made him capable of setting them forth in these his memoirs. It may not be perhaps improper to mention that the author of these memoirs was born at Ewelme in Oxfordshire, descended from an ancient and an honourable family. The Lord Dudley Carleton, who died Secretary of State to King Charles I, was his great-uncle, and in the same reign his father was envoy at the court of Madrid, whilst his uncle, Sir Dudley Carleton, was ambassador to the States of Holland, men in those days respected both for their abilities and loyalty. Memoirs of an English officer and sea. In the year 1672, war being proclaimed with Holland, it was looked upon among nobility and gentry as a blemish not to attend the Duke of York aboard the fleet, who was then declared admiral. With many others, I at that time, about 20 years of age, entered myself a volunteer on board the London, commanded by Sir Edward Sprague, Vice-Admiral of the Red. The fleet set sail from the buoy of the Nore about the beginning of May, in order to join the French fleet then at anchor in St. Helens Road, under the command of the Count d'Estrées. But in executing this design we had a very narrow escape, for De Ruyter, the admiral of the Dutch fleet, having notice of our intentions, waited to have intercepted us at the mouth of the river, but by the assistance of a great fog we passed Dover before he was aware of it, and thus he miscarried, with the poor advantage of taking only one small tender. A day or two after the joining of the English and French, we sailed directly towards the Dutch coast, where we soon got sight of their fleet, a sand called the Galloper lying between. The Dutch seemed willing there to expect an attack from us, but in regard that Charles' man of war had been lost on those sands the war before, and that our ships drawing more water than those of the enemy, an engagement might be rendered very disadvantageous, it was resolved in a council of war to avoid coming to a battle for the present, and to sail deerfully for Sola Bay, which was accordingly put in execution. We had not been in Solebay above 4 or 5 days, when De Ruyter, hearing of it, made his signal for sailing in order to surprise us, and he had certainly had his aim, had there been any breeze of wind to favor him. But though they made use of all their sails, there was so little air stirring that we could see their fleet making towards us long before they came up, notwithstanding which, our admirals found difficulty enough to form their ships into a line of battle so as to be ready to receive the enemy. It was about 4 in the morning of the 28th of May, being Tuesday in Whitsun week, when we first made the discovery, and about 8 the same morning the Blue Squadron, under the command of the Earl of Sandwich, began to engage with Admiral Van Ghent, who commanded the Amsterdam Squadron, and about 9 the whole fleets were under a general engagement. The fight lasted till 10 at night, and with equal fury on all sides, the French excepted, who appeared stationed there, rather as spectators than parties, and as unwilling to be too much upon the offensive for fear of offending themselves. During the fight, the English admiral had 2 ships disabled under him, and was obliged about 4 in the afternoon to remove himself a 3rd time into the London, where he remained all the rest of the fight, until next morning. Nevertheless, on his entrance upon the London, which was the ship I was in, and on our hoisting the standard, De Ruyter and his squadron seemed to double their fire upon her, as if they resolved to blow her out of the water. Notwithstanding all which, the Duke of York remained all the time upon quarter-deck, and as the bullets plentifully whizzed around him, would often rub his hands and cry, "Sprage, Sprage, they follow us still." I am very sensible later times have not been over-favorable in their sentiments of that unfortunate prince's valor. Yet I cannot omit the doing a piece of justice to his memory in relating a matter of fact of which my own eyes were witnesses, and saying that if intrepidity and undauntedness may be reckoned any parts of courage, no man in the fleet better deserved the title of courageous or behaved himself with more gallantry than he did. The English lost the Royal James, commanded by the Earl of Sandwich, which, about 12 hours after the strenuous endeavors of her sailors to disengage her from 2 Dutch fire ships placed on her, one athwart her hawsers, the other on her starboard side, took fire, blew up, and perished, and with her a great many brave gentlemen as well as sailors, and amongst the rest the Earl himself, concerning whom I shall further add that, in my passage from Harwich to the Brill a year or 2 after, the master of the paquet boat told me that, having observed a great flock of gulls hovering in one particular part of the sea, he ordered his boat to make up to it. When discovering a corpse, the sailors would have returned it to the sea, as the corpse of a Dutchman, but, keeping it in his boat, it proved to be that of the Earl of Sandwich. There was found about him between 20 and 30 guineas, some silver, and his gold watch, restoring which to his lady she kept the watch, but rewarded their honesty with all the gold and silver. This was the only ship the English lost in this long engagement, for although the Catherine was taken, and her commander, Sir John Chichley, made prisoner, her sailors, soon after finding the opportunity they had watched for, seized all the Dutch sailors who had been put in upon them, and brought the ship back to our own fleet, together with all the Dutch men prisoners, for which, as they deserved, they were well rewarded. This is the same ship which the Earl of Mulgrave, afterwards Duke of Buckingham, commanded the next sea fight, and has caused to be painted in his house in St. James's Park. I must not omit one very remarkable occurrence which happened in this ship. There was a gentleman aboard her, a volunteer, of a very fine estate, generally known by the name of Hodge Vaughan. This person received, in the beginning of the fight, a considerable wound, which the great confusion during the battle would not give them leave to inquire into, so he was carried out of the way and disposed of in the hold. They had some hogs aboard, which the sailor, under whose care they were, had neglected to feed. These hogs, hungry as they were, found out and fell upon the wounded person, and between dead and alive eat him up to his very skull, which, after the fight was over and the ship retaken as before, was all that could be found of him. Another thing, less to be accounted for, happened to a gentleman volunteer who was aboard the same ship with myself. He was of known personal courage in the vulgar notion of it, his sword never having failed him in many private duels. But notwithstanding all his land metal, it was observed of him at sea that whenever the bullets whizzed over his head or any way incommoded his ears, he immediately quitted the deck and ran down into the hold. At first he was gently reproached, but after many repetitions he was laughed at and began to be despised. Sensible of which, as a testimonial of his valor, he made it his request to be tied to the mainmast. But had it been granted him, I cannot see any title he could have pleaded from hence to true magnanimity, since to be tied from running away can import nothing less than that he would have still continued these signs of cowardice if he had not been prevented. There is a bravery of mind which I fancy few of those gentlemen duellists are possessed of. True courage cannot proceed from what Sir Walter Raleigh finely calls the art or philosophy of quarrel. No, it must be the issue of principle, and can have no other basis than a steady tenet of religion. This will appear more plain if those artists in murder will give themselves leave coolly to consider and answer me this question: why he that had ran so many risks at his sword's point should be so shamefully intimidated at the whiz of a cannon-ball? The names of those English gentlemen who lost their lives as I remember in this engagement: Commissioner Cox, captain of the Royal Prince under the command of the Admiral, and Mr. Trevanion, gentleman to the Duke of York; Mr. Digby, captain of the Henry, second son to the Earl of Bristol; Sir Fletchvile Hollis, captain of the Cambridge, who lost one of his arms in the war before and his life in this; Captain Saddleton of the Dartmouth; the Lord Maidstone, son to the Earl of Winchelsea, a volunteer on board the Charles, commanded by Sir John Harman, Vice Admiral of the Red; Sir Philip Carteret, Mr. Herbert, Mr. Cotterell, Mr. Peyton, Mr. Gose, with several other gentlemen unknown to me, lost their lives with the Earl of Sandwich on board the Royal James; Mr. Vaughan on board the Catherine, commanded by Sir John Chicheley. In this engagement, Sir George Rooke was youngest lieutenant to Sir Edward Sprage. Mr. Russell, afterwards Earl of Orford, was captain of a small fifth-rate called the Phoenix. Mr. Herbert, afterwards Earl of Torrington, was captain of a small fourth-rate called the Monk. Sir Harry Dutton Colt, who was on board the Victory commanded by the Earl of Offaly, is the only man now living that I can remember was in this engagement. But to proceed, the Dutch had one man-of-war sunk, though so near the shore that I saw some part of her mainmast remain above water, with their Admiral Van Ghent, who was slain in the close engagement with the Earl of Sandwich. This engagement lasted 14 hours, and was looked upon the greatest that ever was fought between the English and the Hollander. I cannot here omit one thing which to some may seem trifling, though I am apt to think our naturalists may have a different opinion of it, and find it afford their fancies no undiverting employment in more curious and less perilous reflections. We had on board the London, where, as I have said, I was a volunteer, a great number of pigeons, of which our commander was very fond. These, on the first firing of our cannon, dispersed and flew away, and were seen nowhere near us during the fight. The next day it blew a brisk gale, and drove our fleet some leagues to the southward of the place where they forsook our ship. Yet the day after they all returned safe aboard, not in one flock, but in small parties of 4 or 5 at a time. Some persons at that time aboard the ship, admiring at the manner of their return, and speaking of it with some surprise, Sir Edward Sprage told them that he brought those pigeons with him from the Straits, and that when, pursuant to his order, he left the Revenge men-of-war to go aboard the London, all those pigeons, of their own accord, and without the trouble or care of carrying, left the Revenge likewise, and removed with the sailors on board the London, where I saw them, all which many of the sailors afterwards confirmed to me. What sort of instinct this could proceed from, I leave to the curious. Soon after this sea engagement I left the fleet, and the Parliament, the winter following, manifesting their resentments against 2 of the plenipotentiaries, viz., Buckingham and Arlington, who had been sent over into Holland, and expressing, withal, their great umbrage taken at the prodigious progress of the French arms in the United Provinces, and warmly remonstrating the inevitable danger attending England in their ruin. King Charles, from all this, and for want of the expected supplies, found himself under a necessity of clapping up a speedy peace with Holland, this peace leaving those youthful spirits that had by the late naval war been raised into a generous ferment, under a perfect inactivity at home. They found themselves to avoid a sort of life that was their aversion, obliged to look out for one more active and more suitable to their vigorous tempers abroad. I must acknowledge myself one of that number, and therefore in the year 1674 one resolved to go into Flanders in order to serve as volunteer in the army commanded by His Highness the Prince of Orange. I took my passage accordingly at Dover for Calais, and so went by way of Dunkirk for Brussels. Arriving at which place, I was informed that the army of the Confederates lay encamped not far from Nivelles, and under the daily expectation of an engagement with the enemy. This news made me press forward to the service, for which purpose I carried along with me proper letters of recommendation to Sir Walter Vane, who was at that time a major general. Upon further inquiry, I understood that a party of horse which was to guard some wagons that were going to Count Monterey's army were to set out next morning, so I got an Irish priest to introduce me to the commanding officer, which he readily obliged me in, and they, as I wished them, arrived in the camp next day. I had scarce been there an hour when happened one of the most extraordinary accidents in life. I observed in the east a strange dusty-colored cloud of a pretty large extent, riding not before the wind, for it was a perfect calm, with such a precipitant motion that it was got over our heads almost as soon as seen. When the skirts of that cloud began to cover our camp, there suddenly arose such a terrible hurricane or whirlwind that all the tents were carried aloft with great violence into the air, and soldiers' hats flew so high and thick that my fancy can resemble it to nothing better than those flights of rooks which at dusk of evening, leaving the fields, seek their roosting places. Trees were torn up by the very roots, and the roofs of all the barns belonging to the prince's quarters were blown quite away. This lasted for about half an hour, until the cloud was wholly passed over us, when as suddenly ensued the same pacific calm as before the cloud's approach. Its course was seemingly directly west, and yet we were soon after informed that the fine dome of the great church at Utrecht had greatly suffered by it the same day. And, if I am not mistaken, Sir William Temple in his memoirs mentioned somewhat of it, which he felt at Lillo on his return from the Prince of Orange's camp, where he had been a day or two before. As soon after this as I could get an opportunity, I delivered at his quarters my recommendatory letters to Sir Walter Vane, who received me very kindly, telling me at the same time that there were 6 or 7 English gentlemen who had entered themselves volunteers in the prince's own company of guards, and added that he would immediately recommend me to Count Solmes, their colonel. He was not worse than his word, and I was entered accordingly. Those 6 gentlemen were as follows: Clavers, who since was better known by the title of Lord Dundee; Mr. Collier, now Lord Portmore; Mr. Rooke, since Major General; Mr. Hales, who lately died and was for a long time governor of Chelsea Hospital; Mr. Venner, son of that Venner remarkable for his being one of the 5th Monarchy men; and Mr. Boyce. The 4 first rose to be very eminent, but fortune is not to all alike favorable. In about a week's time after, it was resolved in a council of war to march towards Binch, a small walled town about 4 leagues from Nivelles, the better to cut off the provisions from coming to the Prince of Condé's camp that way. Accordingly, on the 1st day of August, being Saturday, we began our march, and the English volunteers had the favor of a baggage wagon appointed them. Count Souches, the imperial general, with the troops of that nation, led the van. The main body was composed of Dutch under the Prince of Orange, as generalissimo, and the Spaniards under Prince Vaudémont, with some detachments, made the rear guard. As we were upon our march, I, being among those detachments which made up the rear guard, observed a great party of the enemy's horse upon an ascent which I then imagined, as it after proved, to be the Prince of Condé taking a view of our forces under march. There were many defiles which our army must necessarily pass, through which that prince politely enough permitted the imperial and Dutch forces to pass unmolested. But when Prince Vaudémont, with the Spaniards and our detachments, thought to have done the like, the Prince of Condé fell on our rear guard, and after a long and sharp dispute entirely routed them, the Marquis of Escentur, a Spanish lieutenant general, dying upon the spot. Had the Prince of Condé contented himself with this share of good fortune, his victory had been uncontested. But being pushed forward by a vehement heat of temper which he was noted for, and flushed with this extraordinary success, he resolved to force the whole Confederate army to a battle, in order to which he immediately led his forces between our second line and our line of baggage. by which means the latter were entirely cut off, and were subjected to the will of the enemy, who fell directly to plunder, in which they were not a little assisted by the routed Spaniards themselves, who did not disdain at that time to share with the enemy in the plundering of their friends and allies. The English volunteers had their share of this ill fortune with the rest, their wagon appointed them being among those intercepted by the enemy, and I, for my part, lost everything but life, which yet was saved almost as unaccountably as my fellow soldiers had lost theirs. The baggage, as I have said, being cut off, and at the mercy of the enemy, every one endeavored to escape through or over the hedges, and as in all cases of like confusion one endeavors to save himself upon the ruins of others, so here he that found himself stopped by another in getting over the cap of a hedge pulled him back to make way for himself, and perhaps met with the same fortune from a third, to the destruction of all. I was then in the vigor of my youth, and none of the least active, and perceiving how it had fared with some before me, I clapped my left leg upon the shoulders of one who was thus contending with another, and with a spring threw myself over both their heads and the heads at the same time. By this means I not only saved my life, for they were all cut to pieces that could not get over, but from an eminence which I soon after attained, I had an opportunity of seeing and making my observations upon the remaining part of that glorious conflict. It was from that advantageous situation that I presently discovered that the Imperialists who led the van had now joined the main body, and I confess it was with an almost inexpressible pleasure that I beheld, about 3 o'clock, with what intrepid fury they fell upon the enemy. In short, both armies were universally engaged, and with great obstinacy disputed the victory till 11 at night, at which time the French, being pretty well surfeited, made their retreat. Nevertheless, to secure it by a stratagem, they left their lighted matches hanging in the hedges and waving with the air to conceal it from the Confederate army. About 2 hours after, the Confederate forces followed the example of their enemies and drew off, and but neither army had much reason to boast, yet as the Prince of Orange remained last in the field, and Die French had lost what they before had gained, the glory of the day fell to the Prince of Orange, who, although but 24 years of age, had the suffrage of friend and foe of having played the part of an old and experienced officer. There were left that day on the field of battle, by a general computation, not less than 18,000 men on both sides, over and above those who died of their wounds. The loss being pretty equal, only the French carried off most prisoners. Prince Waldeck was shot through the arm, which I was near enough to be an eye-witness of, and my much-lamented friend Sir Walter Vane was carried off dead. A wound in the arm was all the mark of honor that I as yet could boast of, though our cannon in the defiles had slain many near me. The Prince of Condé, as we were next day informed, lay all that night under a hedge, wrapped in his cloak, and either from the mortification of being disappointed in his hopes of victory, or from a reflection of the disservice which his own natural overheat of temper had drawn upon him, was almost inconsolable many days after. And thus ended the famous Battle of Senef. But though common vogue has given it the name of a battle, in my weak opinion it might rather deserve that of a confused skirmish, all things having been forcibly carried on without regularity or even design enough to allow it any higher denomination. For, as I have said before, notwithstanding I was advantageously stationed for observation, I found it very often impossible to distinguish one party from another, and this was more remarkably evident on the part of the Prince of Orange, whose valor and vigor having led him into the middle of the enemy, and being then sensible of his error, by a peculiar presence of mind, gave the word of command in French, which he spoke perfectly well. But the French soldiers, who took him for one of their own generals, making answer that their powder was all spent, it afforded matter of instruction to him to persist in his attack, at the same time that it gave him a lesson of caution to withdraw himself as soon as he could to his own troops. However, the day after, the Prince of Orange thought proper to march to Quarignan, a village within a league of Mons, where he remained some days, till he could be supplied from Bruxelles with those necessaries which his army stood in need of. From thence we marched to Valenciennes, where we again encamped till we could receive things proper for a siege. Upon the arrival whereof, the prince gave orders to decamp and marched his army with a design to besiege Aeth. But having intelligence on our march that the Maréchal de Humier had reinforced that garrison, we marched directly to Oudenarde and immediately invested it. This siege was carried on with such application and success that the besiegers were in a few days ready for a storm, but the Prince of Condé prevented them by coming up to its relief, upon which the Prince of Orange, pursuant to the resolution of a council of war the night before, drew off his forces in order to give him battle, and to that purpose, after the laborious work of filling up our lines of contravallation that the horse might pass more freely, we lay upon our arms all night. Next morning we expected the Imperial General Count Souche to join us, but instead of that he sent back some very frivolous excuses of the inconveniency of the ground for a battle, and after that, instead of joining the Prince, marched off quite another way. The Prince of Orange, with the Dutch and Spanish troops, marched directly for Ghent, exclaiming publicly against the chicanery of Souche, and openly declaring that he had been advertised of a conference between a French Capuchin and that general the night before. Certain it is that that general lay under the displeasure of his master, the Emperor, for that piece of management, and the Count d'Esporques was immediately appointed general in his place. The Prince of Orange was hereupon leaving the army in great disgust, till prevailed upon by the Count de Monterey, for the general safety, to recede from that resolution. However, seeing no likelihood of anything further to be done while Souche was in command, he resolved upon a post of more action, though more dangerous. Wherefore, ordering 10,000 men to march before, he himself soon after folioed to the siege of Grave. The Grave, a strong place, and of the first moment to the Hollanders, had been blocked up by the Dutch forces all the summer. The Prince of Orange, therefore, leaving the main army under Prince Waldeck at Ghent, followed the detachment he had made for the siege of that important place, resolving to purchase it at any rate. On his arrival before it, things began to find new motion, and as they were carried on with the utmost application and fury, the besieged found themselves in a little time obliged to change their haughty summer note for one more suitable to the season. The Prince, from his first coming, having kept those within hotly plied with ball both from cannon and mortars, Monsieur Camillet, the governor, after a few days, being weary of such warm work, desired to capitulate, upon which hostages were exchanged and articles agreed on next morning, pursuant to which the garrison marched out with drums beating and colors flying 2 days after, and were conducted to Charleroi. By the taking this place which made the Prince of Orange the more earnest upon it, the French were wholly expelled their last year's astonishing conquests in Holland. And yet there was another consideration that rendered the surrender of it much more considerable. For the French, being sensible of the great strength of this place, had there deposited all their cannon and ammunition, taken from their other conquests in Holland, which they never were able to remove or carry off, with tolerable prospect of safety, after that prince's army first took the field. The enemy being marched out, the prince entered the town and immediately ordered public thanksgivings for its happy reduction. Then, having appointed a governor and left a sufficient garrison, he put an end to that campaign and returned to The Hague, where he had not been long before he fell ill of the smallpox. The consternation this threw the whole country into is not to be expressed. Anyone that had seen it would have thought that the French had made another inundation greater than the former, but when the danger was over, their joy and satisfaction for his recovery was equally beyond expression. The year 1675 yielded very little remarkable in our army. Limburg was besieged by the French under the command of the Duke of Enghien, which the Prince of Orange, having intelligence of, immediately decamped from his fine camp at Bethlehem, near Louvain, in order to raise the siege. But as we were on a full march for that purpose, and had already reached Rouen, word was brought that the Place had surrendered the day before, upon which advice the Prince, after a short halt, made his little army, for it consisted not of more than 30,000 men, march back to Brabant. Nothing of moment after this occurred all that campaign. In the year 1676, the Prince of Orange, having, in concert with the Spaniards, resolved upon the important siege of Maastricht, the only town in the Dutch provinces then remaining in the hands of the French, it was accordingly invested about the middle of June with an army of 20,000 men, under the command of His Highness Prince Waldeck, with the Grand Army covering the siege. It was some time before the heavy cannon which we expected up the Maes from Holland arrived, which gave occasion to a piece of raillery of Monsieur Calvo the governor, which was as handsomely repartee. That governor, by a messenger intimating his sorrow to find we had pawned our cannon for ammunition bread. Answer was made that in a few days we hoped to give him a taste of the loaves which he should find would be sent him into the town in extraordinary plenty. I remember another piece of raillery which passed some days after between the Rhinegrave and the same Calvo, the former sending word that he hoped within 3 weeks to salute that governor's mistress within the Place. Calvo replied, he'd give him leave to kiss her all over if he kissed her anywhere in 3 months. But our long-expected artillery being at last arrived, all this jest and merriment was soon converted into earnest. Our trenches were immediately opened towards the Dauphin bastion, against which were planted many cannon in order to make a breach, myself as a probationer being twice put upon the forlorn hope to facilitate that difficult piece of service. Nor was it long before such a breach was effected as was esteemed practicable, and therefore very soon after it was ordered to be attacked. The disposition for the attack was thus ordered: 2 sergeants with 20 grenadiers, a captain with 50 men, myself, one of the number, then a party carrying wool sacks, and after them 2 captains with 100 men more, the soldiers in the trenches to be ready to sustain them as occasion should require. The signal being given, we left our trenches accordingly, having about 100 yards to run before we could reach the breach, which we mounted with some difficulty and loss, all our batteries firing at the same instant to keep our action in countenance and favor our design. When we were in possession of the bastion, the enemy fired most furiously upon us with their small cannon through a thin brick wall, by which, and their hand grenadoes, we lost more men than we did in the attack itself. But well had it been had our ill fortune stopped there, for as if disaster must needs be the concomitant of success, we soon lost what we had thus gotten by a small but very odd accident. Not being furnished with such scoops as our enemies made use of in tossing their hand grenadoes some distance off, one of our own soldiers, aiming to throw one over the wall into the counterscarp among the enemy, it so happened that he unfortunately missed his aim, and the grenade fell down again on our side the wall, very near the person who fired it, he starting back to save himself, and some others who saw it fall doing the like. Those who knew nothing of the matter fell into a sudden confusion, and imagining some greater danger than there really was, everybody was struck with a panic fear, and endeavored to be the first who should quit the bastion and secure himself by a real shame from an imaginary evil. Thus was a bastion that had been gloriously gained inadvertently deserted, and that too with the loss of almost as many men in the retreat as had been slain in the onset, and the enemy most triumphantly again took possession of it. Among the slain on our side in this action was an ensign of Sir John Fenwick's regiment, and as an approbation of my services his commission was bestowed upon me. A few days after it was resolved again to storm that bastion as before, out of 3 English and 1 Scotch regiment then in the camp, a detachment was selected for a fresh attack. Those regiments were under the command of Sir John Fenwick, who was afterwards beheaded, Colonel Ralph Widrington and Colonel Ashley of the English, and Sir Alexander Collier, father of the present Lord Portmore of the Scotch. Out of every of these 4 regiments, as before, were detached a captain, a lieutenant, and an ensign, with 50 men. Captain Anthony Bamwell of Sir John Fenwick's regiment, who was now my captain, commanding that attack. At break of day the attack was begun with great resolution, and though vigorously maintained, was attended with the desired success. The bastion was again taken, and in it the commanding officer, who in service to himself more than to us, told us that the center of the bastion would soon be blown up, being to his knowledge undermined for that purpose. But this secret proved of no other use than to make us, by way of precaution, to keep as much as we could upon the rampart. In this attack Captain Barnwell lost his life, and it happened my new commission was wedded, not, as too frequently is the custom, with a debauch, but with a bullet through my hand and the breach of my collar bone with the stroke of a halberd. After about half an hour's possession of the bastion, the mine under it, of which the French officer gave us warning, was sprung, the enemy at the same time making a furious sally upon us. The mine did a little, though the less execution, for being discovered, but the sally no way answered their end, for we beat them back and immediately fixed our lodgment which we maintained during the time of the siege. But to our double surprise, a few days after, they fired another mine under or aside the former, in which they had placed a quantity of grenadoes which did much more execution than the other. Notwithstanding all which, a battery of guns was presently erected upon that bastion, which very considerably annoyed the enemy. The breach for a general storm was now rendered almost practicable, yet before that could be advisably attempted there was a strong hornwork to be taken. Upon this exploit the Dutch troops only were to signalize themselves, and they answered the confidence reposed in them, for though they were twice repulsed, at the third onset they were more successful, and took possession, which they likewise kept to the raising of the siege. There was a stratagem laid at this time, which in its own merit one would have thought should not have failed of a good effect, but to show the vanity of the highest human wisdom it miscarried. On the other side of the Maes, opposite to Maastricht, lies the strong fortress of Wick, to which it is joined by a stone bridge of 6 fair arches. The design was, by a false attack on that regular fortification, to draw the strength of the garrison to its defense, which was but very natural to imagine would be the consequence. Ready to attend that well-concerted false attack, a large, flat-bottomed boat, properly furnished with barrels of gunpowder and other necessaries, was to fall down under one of the middle arches, and when fixed there, by firing the powder to have blown up the bridge, and by that means to have prevented the return of the garrison to oppose a real attack, at that instant of time to be made upon the town of Maastricht by the whole army. The false attack on Wick was accordingly made, which, as proposed, drew the main of the garrison of Maastricht to its defense, and the boat so furnished fell down the river as projected, but unfortunately before it could reach the arch, from the darkness of the night running upon a shoal, it could not be got off, for which reason the men in the boat were glad to make a hasty escape for fear of being discovered, as the boat was next morning, and the whole design laid open. This stratagem thus miscarrying, all things were immediately got ready for a general storm at the main breach in the town, and the rather because the Prince of Orange had received incontestable intelligence that Duke Schomberg, at the head of the French army, was in full march to relieve the place. But before everything could be rightly got ready for the intended storm, though some there were who pretended to say that a dispute raised by the Spaniards with the Dutch about the propriety of the town when taken was the cause of that delay, we heard at some distance several guns fired as signals of relief, upon which we precipitately and as most imagined shamefully drew off from before the place and joined the grand army under Prince Waldeck. But it was matter of yet greater surprise to most on the spot that when the armies were so joined we did not stay to offer the enemy battle. The well-known courage of the prince, then generalissimo, was so far from solving this riddle that it rather puzzled all who thought of it. However, the prevailing opinion was that it was occasioned by some great misunderstanding between the Spaniards and the Dutch, and experience will evince that this was not the only disappointment of that nature occasioned by imperfect understandings. Besides the number of common soldiers slain in this attack, which was not inconsiderable, we lost here the brave Ringrave, a person much lamented on account of his many other excellent qualifications as well as that of a general, Colonel Ralph Widrington, and Colonel Dolman, who had not enjoyed Widrington's commission above a fortnight. Captain Douglas, Captain Barnwell, and Captain Lee were of the slain among the English, who indeed had borne the whole brunt of the attack upon the Dauphin's bastion. I remember the Prince of Orange during the siege received a shot through his arm,